Shalom, shalom, peace and blessings. Now let's get straight into it. Today we're going back into Daniel chapter 11, picking up at verse 3 now. Last time we did verses 1 through 2. So let's get it. See what we got here. So this is Daniel chapter 11, verse 3. It says, "And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." Now, this is referring to no other than Alexander the quote unquote great, or who I like to say Alexander the freak or the creep. And it's really something else. The fact that they even named this man, at least after his life, the great. In this society, they teach us that Alexander, who was Alexander the Third or Alexander the Macedonian, is the great. They don't even call Christ the great, at least universally. Maybe if you're a Christian or something like that. But, and this man conquered many lands and killed many, many people, man. And, had soldiers raping women and stuff like that. But he's called the quote unquote great. And, we're about to get some history on Alexander the Great, quote unquote. And also, let's talk about his lineage. But first, let's prove that this is talking about Alexander, the quote unquote great, at least what we know in history is Alexander the Great. Let's keep going. Let's get it. All right, this is Daniel chapter 8. And I've actually previously done a lesson on Daniel chapter 8. I need to get it uploaded back into on this channel here. Because when I did it, it was listed as on YouTube as unlisted. But anyways, let's go. Daniel chapter 8 in verse 1. "In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first." So this chapter is going to the four kingdoms, of course. Now it says here, vision of the ram and goat. So let's see here. Let's go to verse 4. It says, "I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great." Verse 5, "And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west of the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes." Verse 6, "And he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power." So let's get 7 and 8. "And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him," meaning great anger, "and smote the ram, and brake his two horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. And he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up four notable ones towards the four winds of heaven." Now, this is referring to, matter of fact, it just says it right here. Let's get it. Verse 21, it says, and look, it just says the goat here. Matter of fact, verse 20, it says, "The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia." So that ram having the two horns was referring to the Persian and Mede Empire, or their rulership, which we talked about slightly in part 1 of Daniel chapter 11 here. And then it says the goat, verse 21, "And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that's between his eyes is the first king." So the first king is referring to Alexander the quote unquote great, that conquered the Persians and the Medes and took rulership really over most of the known world at that time. But to get into rulership, the Macedonians, they had to take over the Persian Medes, take over Darius the Great. Okay, so now an even more direct account. Let's get First Maccabees chapter 1. And by the way, we're about to get more on this. I'm just making an establishment here. We setting up the foundation, but we're really about to go in and talk about Alexander the quote unquote great. We're going to talk about his lineage and prove that he is or was an Edomite. All right, or what you would call today a Caucasian. All right, a so-called white man. We're going to prove that with the scriptures and some history. Then we're going to talk about some of Alexander's exploits. All right, and then we'll move on to the next verse. But let's get it. It says, First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 1. And it happened after that Alexander, son of Philip, the Macedonian. Okay, Philip was his father. Bugging out, man. All right, who came out of the land of Kittim or Chittim, had smitten Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, that he reigned in his stead the first over Greece. Now, this is what we were just reading about in Daniel chapter 8, as you see. Darius, the king of the Persians and Medes. He was the last ruler over that Persian and Mede empire. All right. And Alex took over because he defeated him. Okay. And Darius, man, he was kind of running, man. He started fleeing the scene. But anyways, verse 2, and made many wars and won many strongholds and slew the kings of the earth and went through to the ends of the earth and took spoils of many nations, insomuch that the earth was quiet before him, whereupon he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. Okay, so as you see, this is referring to Alexander. All right, he took many strongholds, slew many kings of the earth, meaning he took over many lands and the men that ruled over them, and made many wars. And he did all of this in a short period of time. That's why it was worth noting, because in the amount of time that he lived, I mean, he was very young. He took over rulership from his father Philip at the age of 20, if I'm not mistaken. And in just like 12 years, he took over, thousands of miles of land. It was vast. Okay, I think I got that pulled up. Let's kind of show this empire here. Now, this is a massive amount of land to take over, again, in the amount of time that he did. It says the empire of Alexander, 334 to 323 BC. Since we're not properly taught history, it's really hard to get a grasp of how much, area this is to cover, again, in that amount of time to, win that many battles and wars. It's really something else. And of course, I understand that's why they call him the quote unquote great. But again, why would you be exalting someone that kills, innocent people, taking over lands, conquering lands and indigenous people? Other than the fact that you like the fact that he did that, because it's pretty much what the so-called white man does right now. We say going over to India, acting like he got he got some type of profitable cause over there, but he really poisoned the people trying to take over the land over there, and of course in Africa as well too. With a sword or a knife in their back, ready to kill some folks. But anyway, let's go. So as you see, this is Macedon here. You see some of the notable Greek city states here, because Greece, man, it was divided into city states. So like each city state had their own stuff going on a lot of times, like Sparta, Athens, Ephesus, All right, so on and so forth. And this also shows some of the years of the battles, some of Alexander's famous battles, like the battles of Granicus, 333. I believe that was a battle of Issus, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think it might say it on here somewhere. But yeah, it just shows his the battle of Isis or Issus right here, 333 BC. But really, what I wanted to go to here too is you see this right here. Over here, it says the Caucasus. This is really where these people came from, man. This is really where Alexander the quote unquote great, or really Alexander the Creep, and his progeny, his ancestors. This is really where they came from, the mountains, man. Yeah, let's kind of prove that right now. Let's go into it. So to kind of get an understanding, and we're gonna go back here. This is the Wikipedia entry for Alexander the Third of Macedon, or Alexander the quote unquote great. We're gonna go back into this. But one thing I want to go into is the name of the empire or the dynasty of the Macedonians, which we know Alexander was a Macedonian. Okay. Now let's go into that. It says the Argead or Argead dynasty. The Argead dynasty, also known as the Timinid dynasty. Now that's something to take note here. It says was an ancient Macedonian royal house of Dorian Greek provenance. They were the founders and the ruling dynasty of the kingdom of Macedon from about 700 to 310 BC. Now this is going to give us a great hint of where these people come from, because this dynasty was also known as the Timinid dynasty. And now this dynasty would be the dynasty that Alexander the Greek, the dynasty that he came from. Okay, so that's why this is worth going into. But let's get some more on this portion here, the Timinid dynasty. Now, let's see here. Okay, so now we're here on the history of Macedonia. It says Alexander the Greek and his Greek origins. It says Alexander the Third of Macedon was born in 356 BC in Pella, capital of the Macedonian kingdom in the ancient Greek state. He was the son of Macedonian king. I don't know why that's kind of burped out there, but it should say Philip II. And Olympias, princess of Melatians in Epirus. Okay, so the Macedonian royal house. Now it says the Macedonian royal house was called Argeads or Timonidae. According to the tradition, the founder of the royal house of Perdiccas, even if the name of the founder differs in reference in the ancient source used, along with his brothers, the Timonidae came to the place called Macedonia from the Greek city of Argos. So notice it says came to the place called Macedonia from the Greek city of Argos, because Alexander, in his ancestry, they're not from, or they weren't from Macedon. They weren't from there. Even here in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, it says who came out the land of Kittim. It always says that they conquered a land or they took over a land, but they weren't aboriginals there. Does that make sense? Y'all picking up what I'm dropping off here? Alexander was not from Macedon. All right. He wasn't from Greece. They weren't originally from there. Okay, but it says the Timonidae. All right. So where else did we see this term, the Timonidae? All right, so check this out. It says Timinus. I could go into this, but it's just a bunch of names here. This is what I really want to get. It says Timinus. His tomb was shown at Timnath near Lerna. His descendants, the Timnidae, being expelled from Argos, that's in Greece, are said to have founded the kingdom of Macedonia, where the kings of Macedonia called themselves Timnidae. So Timnidae was a name from a man named Timidus. Okay, his descendants were called the Timnidae. All right, and we know the kings of Macedonia called themselves Timnidae. Why is this relevant? Why do I keep accentuating that word there, Timidus or Timnidae, or in this Wikipedia entry here, the Timinid dynasty? Because it gives us a clue of where these people came from and who they were in history and who they are today. Okay. Now let's get this. It says, this is Genesis chapter 36 in the scriptures. All right, let's get verse 8. And if we go all the way up to the top here, it says Esau moves. Verse 1 says, now these are the generations of Esau, who is Edom. Let's go to verse 8. Thus dwelt Esau in Mount Seir. Esau is Edom. Like I said, we're about to prove that Alexander the quote-unquote great was an Edomite. And the Edomites are the so-called white men, or the so-called white man. When I say so-called white man, I'm talking about, any person that, is quote-unquote Caucasian today, man and woman. But yeah, Esau is the so-called white man of today. And Alexander the quote-unquote great was a so-called white man. All right, or Caucasian. And we're about to see the scriptures give us, clarification of that. All right, it says descendants of Esau. And these are the generations of Esau, the father of the Edomites in Mount Seir. Well, again, they don't call them Caucasians today. They don't call the so-called white man a Caucasian for nothing. They've always dwelt in caves. All right, the Caucasus Mountains are in Mount Seir. That's the only place that they've ever dwelt or actually been from. Okay, and really even Mount Seir, they took over the people there, so they're not really particularly from anywhere. A lot of places like Europe and Australia, if you do the research on it, you'll find that it was really, so-called black people there first, or some other nation of people, some other nation of people of color that were there first before the so-called white man. But anyways, verse 10, these are the names of Esau's sons. Eliphaz, the son of Adah, the wife of Esau. Ruel, the son of Bashemeth, the wife of Esau. And the sons of Eliphaz were Teman. Y'all see where I'm going here now? Omar, Zepho, and Gatam, and Kenaz. Now let's go to the entry here for Teman, or Taman. All right, Taman says south. Could that be an allusion to the king of the south that we read here in a verse 5 in Daniel chapter 11? Okay, could it be? Let's see. It says the son of Eliphaz, grandson of Esau, one of the dukes of Edom. The region occupied by the descendants of one located east of Idumea. So what I'm saying here is the reason that you had Alexander the quote-unquote great and his descendants being told that they were from the Argead or the Timinid dynasty is because they knew that they were Edomites. They knew they came from Timan or Taman. Okay? It's the same thing, you see? Taman or Timinid or Timinidae. Same thing, man. Okay, and what is Who was Teman? He was an Edomite. All right. He was the son of Eliphaz, the grandson of Esau. Esau is Edom. See this connection here? Again, these people were unlike the other people there in Greece, at least most of them. In part one, we talked about the Danites, all right, being the Spartans. These were not the same people, even though they both were in Greece. Again, Greece had city states where they were separate and had their own, uh, laws per se, moral codes, standards, culture, so on and so forth. They had similarities, but a lot of things were different. And a lot of times you have even different quote unquote ethnicities, different tribes of people that lived in Greece. Okay. So the Edomites, or the so-called white people, they were in Macedon. Okay. And that's, again, we see the proof here. All right. This is not out of nowhere. Because, see, back in this time, you had people that actually knew who they were, from an ancestral standpoint, meaning they could trace their lineage back to a lot of the men that we read about in the scriptures. Like, for example, a lot of times, like in Genesis chapter 10, some of the quote unquote Africans, over there in in Africa, they'll tell you that they're Cushites. Okay. All of these names, or the scriptures give you the full breakdown of all the people that came after the flood. Okay. And what you see a lot of times in modern history is all these different names of people that were given these modern names, which can confuse people because you're not getting the name from the scriptures. So a lot of times you're going to make a disconnection between the people today and the nations known in the Bible. Okay. That's why, vast majority of our people don't understand that we are the Israelites of the Bible, because we're not called Israelites today. What are we called? Black. All right. African American, Negro, things like that. When the ancestral name, all right, goes back to Jacob or Israel. Okay. Just trying to explain that fully, just in case you have somebody here that's, some brothers and sisters that may be new. Now we have the history of the Peloponnesian War, written by Thucydides in 431 BC, saying the same thing pretty much. Let's see, originally, it's pretty much saying the same thing here. I'm not going to go all the way into it, but down here in this section, it says the country of the sea coast, now called Macedonia, was first acquired by Alexander, the father of Perdiccas. This is referring to Alexander the First, which was the father of Perdiccas, not Alexander the quote unquote great. And his ancestors originally Timidids from Argos. Okay, so these people knew that they came from Teman, or they knew that they were Edomites. All right. And of course, we have a linkage in the scriptures too to the Amalekites. All right. So now there's a linkage from the Timonites and the Amalekites. So it's really hard to make the case that, Alexander the quote unquote great wasn't an Edomite. All right. You have it all right here in history. All right. So let's keep going. Matter of fact, let's get Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 7. It says, concerning Edom, thus saith the Lord of hosts, is wisdom no more in Teman? Is counsel perished from the prudent? Is their wisdom vanished? This chapter is going into, at least this portion of this chapter is going into the prophecy against Edom, because Edom is prophesied to be destroyed. Verse 10, but I have made Esau bare. I have uncovered his secret places, and he should not be able to hide himself. His seed is spoiled, and his brethren, and his neighbors, and he is not. Okay, not in the scriptures normally means dead. Okay, deceased, giving up the ghost. How Edom is going to be in the end times. Okay, so the reason I went into this just so we can see, the link up here. Let's get verse 20. Therefore, hear the counsel of the Lord that he hath taken against Edom and his purposes that he hath proposed against the inhabitants of Teman. Surely the least of the flock shall draw them out. Surely he shall make their habitations desolate with them. Okay. Now, again, Alexander was a Macedonian. Let's get proof that the Macedonians also were called Amalekites, or they were Amalekites. Okay, so sometimes you see Temanites, or they were from Teman, and sometimes from Amalekite, or from Amalek, excuse me. But both are just tribes of Esau. It's the same thing. Now, we know that the so-called Jewish man today is really from Amalek. Okay. But obviously you had some of those that claim to be from Teman as well. Which again is the same thing. They're both were sons of Eliphaz, and Eliphaz was the son of Esau. Okay. So let's get Esther chapter 3 and verse 10. It says, and the king took his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. So Haman was an Agagite. Now, when you see the term Agagite, it's a title. It's just like Pharaoh, Caesar, things like that. It's a or even Duke. It's a term of nobility. Okay, so we know Haman was called an Agagite, but let's see where we see that term again. Let's get 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 6. And Saul said unto the Kenites, go, depart, get you down from the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For ye showed kindness to all the children of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until thou come to Shur, that is over against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. So we see that the Amalekites, which were the sons of Esau, the Edomites, the so-called white man of today, were called Agagites or Agag. Okay, Agag was the king of the Amalekites, but we know that term, the term Agag or the Agagites were all just Edomites or Amalekites. And we see here in the editions of Esther chapter 16 and verse 10, the same Haman that we were reading about earlier. In Esther chapter 3 verse 10, Haman the Agagite, okay, he was called a Macedonian as well, verse 10. For Ammon, or that's really just Haman, a Macedonian, the son of Hammedatha, being indeed a stranger from the Persian blood and far distant from our goodness, and as a stranger received of us. Now, Haman was called a Macedonian. Who else was called a Macedonian? Alexander the quote-unquote Greek. Okay? And the Macedonians were Amalekites, or even Temanites, all right, which were both just Edomites. And we know that Alexander was a so-called white man, which is a Macedonian, which is an Amalekite, which is just an Edomite, which is the so-called white man. So we just go into his lineage so we can understand what we read here in Daniel chapter 11. Okay. And that's also why you always see, the first king, between his eyes is the first king, because Alexander was one of the first kings, or really the first king, successful king, meaning successful in the conquering of lands, that was a so-called white man or was an Edomite. Okay, you had other kings in Grecia already at this time, so why does it keep saying first king? All right, like it says here too, he reigned in his stead, the first over Greece. All right, because really these were cave people before this, before Alexander's reign. He was pretty much just cave people. So that's on Alexander's lineage, man. All right, so we could get more on that, but let's go back here. Let's go to this Wikipedia page, and I like to go into this in detail because a lot of times I could have just said, all right, this is talking about Alexander, gave a couple of scriptures and just headed out and went on to the next verse. But I like to go into detail so we see as many witnesses as possible. All right. Now, the Wikipedia page says Alexander the Great. Alexander the Third of Macedon, okay, commonly known as Alexander the Great, was a king of the ancient Greek kingdom of Macedon. All right, of the Argead or Timanid dynasty. He succeeded his father Philip II to the throne in 336 BC at the age of 20 and spent most of his ruling years conducting a lengthy military campaign throughout Western Asia and Egypt. By the age of 30, he created one of the largest empires in history, stretching from Greece to northwestern India. That's a long way. He was undefeated in battle and is widely considered to be one of history's greatest and most successful military commanders. So that's why they label him as the quote unquote great. But again, there's a lot of lives lost here. A lot of indigenous people killed and lands taken over, in this process. So, why is this supposed to be glorified? It's like glorifying Hitler or something, which they really be doing. Honestly, because that's all they always talking about. And they're really just glorifying them, to be honest. Because if you don't want to glorify somebody, why make documentaries and, always bring up their names? Like a serial killer that came out with that new documentary on Netflix, Jeffrey Dahmer. Really, they be glorifying these people. Because if not, why would you even, continue to bring them up like that? But let's go back in the first Maccabees real quick, just to kind of coincide with what we read there in that Wikipedia entry. It says, verse 4, and he gathered a mighty strong host and ruled over countries and nations and kings who became tributaries unto him. So, scriptures are saying the same thing here that whoever made this entry into Wikipedia is pretty much saying too. Now it says, until the age of 16, Alexander was tutored by Aristotle. This should sound familiar to you, Aristotle, his name. All right, but as you see here, he's depicted as a so-called white man, but that's not the case. Aristotle was actually a so-called black man. I'm just going to read this brief entry right here that's on the screen. It says, Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher and polymath, meaning that he was, excellent in many different fields of life. That's what a polymath is. Poly, of course, being in plural. His writings cover a broad range of subjects, including physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, drama, music, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, politics, meteorology. It's proved that he was a so-called black man. Now it says miniature depicting Aristotle right, instructing Alexander the Greek left. From the work, the description and uses of animals, compiled from works by Aristotle and Ubad Allah ibn Bakhistu. This undated copy was probably made in Baghdad in the first half of the 13th century British Library. Now look at Alexander, the quote-unquote Greek, depicted as a so-called white man. All right, and then look at Aristotle, how he was depicted as a so-called black man. All right. And we're going to get proof that, Alexander, the quote-unquote great, he actually dealt with, one of his generals, Cletus the Black. We about to go into that now. He had so-called black men around him tutoring him, man. Because remember, again, Greece or Greek is not just, it's not a one nation thing. It's not Greece or Greek does not equal so-called white. It doesn't. Okay, it's a land. And of course, within this land, you have city states. Like Washington, D.C. is a city state. That's separate from the U.S., technically speaking. Okay. Now, I could go into this, but, Aristotle is not, it's not what we're going into right now. But I just want to show that he was a so-called black man. Let's keep going into this Wikipedia entry here. I just want to go into a few things out this Wikipedia entry because, this is something that brothers and sisters can kind of go into in their own time. But just for the sake of this lesson, I just like bringing out some certain aspects I don't see talked about as much if I'm privy to it. Now it says, in early years, Alexander was raised by a nurse, Lineage, sister of Alexander's future general, Cletus the Black. Cletus the Black? Why was his name Cletus the Black? It says Cletus the Black was an officer of the Macedonian army led by Alexander the Great. He saved Alexander's life at a battle of Granicus in 334 BC and was killed by him in a drunken quarrel 6 years later. Crazy. So now let's prove here that this was a so-called black man. That's why he was given the name Black, Cletus the Black. Not from a race standpoint. When you see black being used, it's referring to their that person's skin color a lot of time, not the race known as black. So it says Cletus, foster brother or Cletus of Alexander the Great and commander of Alexander's cavalry, was a son of Dropidas and Linus, the nurse of Alexander. Plutarch, Diodorus Siculus, and Curtius, writers of iniquity, speak of him as Cletus or Clitus Niger. Niger being Latin for Negro, or really just black. Okay, so in those days, one's surname was often given to him because of his color or some physical characteristic. Like I said, not going into the quote unquote race of black, but their physical characteristics. So it was more than likely, a dark skinned brother. But as you see, they don't talk about this in history because they want you to think that, all Greeks were so-called white, and that's not the case. Or if they were so-called black, it's just some scattered here and there. Just one or two, something like that. But that's not the case. Okay. So-called black people were still in, very high positions in Greece at this time. So, don't fall for the okie doke, man. All right, I just want to go into Cletus the Black real quick. His death, man, is crazy. It's worth looking into if you haven't looked into it yet, because Alexander, the quote unquote great, that was one of his best friends. Cletus the Black was, but he ended up killing them. Man, they were all drunk. Cletus started kind of going in on them. Man, it's crazy. I read about it right here in this entry here in this in Plutarch's testimony of the life of Alexander. So definitely worth looking into if you haven't already. One other thing I wanted to talk about, it says here Alexander the Great was mentioned in the Bible and he knew it. So it says the civilization altering life of Alexander the Great is well known to most students of history. But there is one chapter of his saga that is as seldom discussed as it is fascinating. Not only was Alexander's reign predicted in the Old Testament long before he was born, but when Alexander visited Jerusalem, the high priest showed him the Bible prophecies. The priest explained, Alexander, these prophecies are about you. If you're not familiar with the intriguing chapter of history, it may be astounding to learn how Alexander reacted to that statement. So, the testimony of Josephus is that Alexander, he was actually aware of Daniel chapter 11, Daniel chapter 8, of the scriptures that was prophesying about him before he was even born. The scriptures were already written about him, really hundreds of years before he was born. Now, this is not directly in the scriptures, so sometimes with things like this, you might have to take with a grain of salt. Do I believe it to be true? Personally, I do, because it makes sense that Alexander the Greek, he didn't take over Jerusalem while he was alive. You didn't see that happen until after his death, when the Greeks took over Jerusalem. But the fact that he was taking control of everywhere else, to me, kind of gives credence to this. It makes sense. Okay, so it says here, Alexander, these ancient prophecies are about you. Josephus, the quote-unquote Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century AD, said that when Alexander was just about to enter the city of Jerusalem, the quote-unquote Jewish high priest at that time, a man named Judua, met him on the outskirts of the city. Judua led a procession of affluent residents of Jerusalem. They hoped that by walking out to meet this mighty warrior, they might keep Jerusalem from being destroyed by his army. The sight of the high priest in the procession gave Alexander pause. He entered the city peacefully. Once inside, Judua brought Alexander to the temple and showed him some passages in the book of Daniel. The Most High had inspired the book of Daniel to write his book back in 535 BC, about 180 years before Alexander was born. We know that because Daniel chapter 10, verse 1, in which Daniel says he wrote in the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus the Great, historians agree that would have been around 535 BC. Judua would have shown Alexander such passages, Daniel chapter 11, verse 2 and 3, which discuss the Persian Empire pushing against Greece and eventually being conquered by a mighty Greek king. So this is what we're going into right now. And that's why I want to go into it. I think this is, valid, and it's something, if you're not aware of, you should definitely be aware of. So this is Daniel chapter 11 and verse 2. Since we read that many times now, let's keep going. Judua would also likely have shown him companion passages in Daniel 8, which give more details about this quote-unquote mighty king of Greece who would defeat the Persian Empire. These passages truly are about Alexander the Great and they were written around 200 years before his reign began. You can imagine Alexander the Great standing in the temple next to the high priest. You can imagine him being shown an ancient scroll with the words of Daniel written on it. Thanks to the education he had received from Aristotle, Alexander could read the Hebrew words Daniel had written. He needed no translation. Well, yeah, because Aristotle most likely was a Hebrew. That's how he knew the language. But he knew other languages too. He did. He knew other languages, but I know he was a so-called black man. All right. But anyway, it says he had also been told by his mother his whole life that he was no ordinary man, but someone with divine blood coursing through his veins. So his mother, she actually said that she gave birth to Alexander from a virgin birth as well. She was impregnated by Zeus or whatever version of that god you want to say. This passage in Daniel, of course, did not say he was divine in any way, but Judua would have told Alexander that the book had the true God's fingerprints all over it. So, that's just a testimony of how amazing that the scriptures are, that you will have these prophecies written, before they actually take place, just like you have the scriptures that are going to take, they're going to come to pass. They're already written as well right now. And it's just, it's remarkable. All right. But, no other book or no other people has, a testimony, or they have prophecies that were written hundreds of years before they actually took place. Everybody else, man, they getting something wrong. Like the Quran, no sir. All right. Or anything else you want to bring up. It ain't like the scriptures, man. But I think that was something worth going into. Now let's look at this. It says 3 times Alexander the Great wasn't so great. I guess it was written by these guys, man. Oh my. What is going on here? I guess they sodomites like Alexander quote unquote great was. I'm not gonna go into the whole account here, but let's go into this. It says once he was situated in the palace complex, Alexander knew he couldn't contain his men. He gave his army free rein to sack Persepolis, the first time he had done so to a city that had willingly surrendered. What resulted was an orgy of ferocious greed, as Friedman calls it. The soldiers broke into homes, killing the men and raping the women and girls. They grabbed anything of value, hacking limbs off golden statues, and sometimes even killing each other in the quarrels over fine purple cloth and silver jewelry. So Alexander let his men, rape the women. And this alone is why you should not have this man called a quote unquote great. But it is what it is, man. It is what it is. Let's keep moving. There's some other facts that I found about quote unquote Alexander. Normally I don't like going into articles like this, but they did actually sort their site, so it's okay in this case. But normally I like to go kind of straight to the source when I go into these type of accounts. But it says 8 what the F facts about his early life, Alexander the quote unquote great. It says Alexander didn't like sex or sleeping. I've always thought of Alexander the Great as a gay superhero of sorts. A gay superhero, wow. Well, I guess he could be in Marvel and DC right now then, huh? But he had sexual relations with both males and females. Yeah, that's how they got down, man. He had 3 sons from various women, though he did seem to prefer boys, even from an early age. In fact, his overbearing mother, Olympias, was worried about his lack of interest in the ladies and went so far as to hire the hottest prostitute around, a Thracian, a Thracian beauty named Kalizina, to seduce her son. It didn't work. So, his mama went through and was like, man, this boy ain't getting none, man. He don't even like girls. Let me go find the baddest little chick around and see if Alexander gonna want to bust down. But he still didn't, man. Golly, that's why I call him Alexander the Creep, man. It seems that the unrestrained passion and subsequent wariness of lovemaking deeply troubled the young man, Friedman writes. As Alexander would confess years later, sex and sleep more than anything else reminded him that he was mortal, because he thought himself to be a god. So, what he's saying is that reminding him that he wasn't a god. Sex and sleep did, but, this fool, man, he was just gay. That's all that is. The assassination of his father, Philip II, partly blamed the king for his being gang raped. So I read that account too. Man, this dude had a lot of stuff going on that they don't like to talk about. When I say they, the so-called white man in the history books try to act like this man was just around here conquering people and with paper swords or some ish, man. All right, so what else I want to go into? Just this really quickly, another account. It says a major contributor of Alexander's political education, Aristotle, provided Alexander with a liberal arts education centered around morals, forms, and Homer's Iliad. Aristotle had hoped that Alexander would become an ideal ruler, a philosopher king, and Pampasilis, but Alexander began to idolize the violence of the Iliad. He idolized the wrathful side of Achilles and loved the endless pursuit of glory. At times, Alexander was unpredictable in his fits of violence. In one town, he would allow his men to rape the women, plunder entire towns, and enslave children, while in other towns he would demonstrate compassion, mercy, and forgiveness. For example, in the sack of Thebes, Alexander killed nearly all the men and enslaved over 30,000 women and children. But this man is the great. All right. Killing all of the men and enslaving women and children and raping them. All right. That's how also you have a lot of intermixture within the nations as well. During this time when Alexander would let his men just rape all the women, you see a lot of intermixing, man. All right, so-called mixed babies, not so-called black and white, but Persian is, things of that nature. All the lands that they took over. Okay, it's in India. All right, all throughout that massive empire that he had. So all of these indigenous people, they was raping the women and creating these little half-breeds, little Edomite babies around here, man. But and over there in Egypt too, that's why a lot of them don't have their original look, probably as well too. I want to get some accounts of quote unquote Alexander the Great, because normally when I hear about Alexander the Great from other brothers that make other lessons and things like that, normally they just kind of go into what they read about it, but they, and I'm not saying this is like, anything done on purpose or nothing like that. I'm just saying normally when I see or hear anything about quote unquote Alexander the Great, it's not normally from sources. So I kind of want to just pull up some accounts of quote unquote Alexander the Great so brothers will have it as well. Now, the last thing that we're going to go into is verse 4. So last time I thought I was going to get to more verses, but the next lesson we should definitely be covering way more verses, because we still got all the way up to this chapter goes into 45. So we got to start covering some more ground. But I did want to lay some foundations first, so as we go through, we'll better understand what we're looking at. But for right now, and I'm not even going to cover this in full yet. In the next part, we'll go more into it. But let's get verse 4. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and he shall be divided. And this is talking about, quote unquote, Alexander the Great. And shall be divided towards the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside those. So what this means is his posterity, meaning his sons or his lineage, that's not what his kingdom was divided up into. So when Alexander, the quote unquote great, died, his kingdom was broken into four different parts. Okay. And not to his sons or any of his posterity. It was given to four of his generals. Do we have another account? Yeah, let's go into back into Daniel chapter 8. Now verse 22. It says, now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. So this is after Alexander the Greek, after he died. His kingdom was divided into four different generals here. The four different generals were known as the Diadochi. All right, the Diadochi. Remember, this is the kingdom. Let's kind of scroll out here. This is the kingdom that Alexander had conquered or created here. Wow, that's crazy, man. Because think about it, like you could be ruling over here, and this is still a large piece of land. Like, look at all of this, man, that he conquered. But anyway, that's what he conquered, and this was divided into four different generals, essentially. Sometimes you see it as five, but for the main part, you have Cassander. Okay, Cassander, he took over Macedonia. And then you have Lysicamus. Lysicamus, he took over Thrace, Asia Minor, and Macedon as well, too. Then you have Seleucus that covers all this land. He was known in the scriptures as the king of the north. Okay. And then also you have the king of the south, known in the scriptures as Ptolemy or Ptolemy. All right. He was a quote unquote king of the south because he became ruler over Egypt. Okay. Originally from the kingdom of Macedon, northern Greece, he went on to become ruler of Egypt and part of Alexander's former empire. Okay. Ptolemy was the pharaoh of the Ptolemaic Egypt to his death. Okay. He was the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt until the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC, turning the country into a Hellenistic kingdom in Alexandria into a center of Greek culture. All right. So that's pretty much what's going on there. After Alexander fell ill, which some say he was poisoned, some say he died from STDs. It's not 1,000% certain. I would probably lean with, or some type of other illness too, by the way. I probably lean towards, I don't know. He could have been poisoned, but it could have just been some type of illness. I mean, he was out there doing whatever, as we read. You know, man could have been the first recipient of HIV or something. I don't know. But yeah, after he died, his kingdom was broken down into four different segments. Essentially, four different generals took over, and they had war over this land too as well. It wasn't just, okay, you got this, you got this. They had the wars of the Diadochi. Okay, which means successors. All right. They fought over control over his empire after his death. All right. The Wars of Diadochi. Okay. That's what decided who was going to get what or what portion of the land, essentially. Okay. Okay. It says the most notable Diadochi include Ptolemy, Antigonus, Cassander, and Seleucus. Really, that's should be Lysigemus there. But yeah, that's pretty much the breakdown in verse 4. Now we're gonna go more into that next time. Right now, again, I just want to establish some history on Alexander the Greek, show some of his exploits, how he was raping mugs and taking over lands, killing folks, indigenous people. Show his origin and that he was an Edomite or so-called white man. Yeah, that's it for this part. So that's gonna be part 2. Next time we will go more deeper into this chapter, get a little bit more on who the king of the south was, the king of the north. And yeah, Lord willing, hopefully divide the word of truth. So for now, I bid everyone a mighty shalom.